I, 25, male, don't get along with my stepdad, Rick, 52, male, and never have. He married my mom, 47, female, when I was 15 after dating for a couple of months, and it's been 10 years, but I think I still hate him more than anyone on this planet. My mom and dad, 50, male, got divorced a few years after I was born, maybe when I was 4 or 5. My mom had full custody for the first few years, while dad had only visiting rights, and he'd come to see me on the weekends. But they modified that arrangement when I was a little older, around 7, and my dad had partial custody after that. I'd spend half the month at my dad's and the other half with my mom. My dad's an architect, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom for most of her life, so I was quite close to my mother growing up. When I was around 16, my dad was offered a great position in a firm, but for that he'd have to move out of state and wouldn't get to see me often. By then, my mom had married Rick, and he was horrible, so I was having a hard time whenever I'd be living with my mom and would vent about Rick to my father constantly. So he was aware of the situation at my mother's house and asked me if I'd be willing to move with him. But I said no because I didn't want to abandon my mother. My dad almost turned that offer down after that, but I convinced him to take it up because it was a great opportunity for him, and I didn't want him to miss out on anything for me. So my dad left, and we'd talk on video calls and stuff, and we'd see each other on the holidays, but I did miss him still. Living with Rick made me miserable because he was a total bully and would make it a point to put me down every time he saw me around the house. He hadn't been that way while he was still dating my mother, even though he had been awkward around me back then. But after they got married, he turned into a completely different person, and I think it was probably because he wanted me out of their lives and was trying to make it as difficult as possible for me to stay with them. But I wasn't going to abandon my mother, so I just kept my head down and tried to ignore him, even fighting with him whenever I thought I couldn't ignore it, but I didn't leave. And he wasn't just horrible to me, but he was also cruel to my mom. He would push her around like she was nothing, and my mom would let him walk all over her. I tried to convince her to leave him several times, but she insisted that he was a good man, and I shouldn't judge him by what I saw, since there was a lot that I didn't know about him. I didn't buy it, and I believed that he was just as horrible as I thought him to be. He was also pretty jealous of my dad, and it was quite evident because he didn't allow my mother to keep anything from her previous relationship with my father. He told her to burn everything, but she didn't and kept it all in the attic instead. He was extremely insecure, and it would just become very obvious whenever my dad was in town to visit for the holidays or my birthday. And he'd bring expensive gifts for me along with him, which I would parade around the house just to rub salt in his wounds and make him feel even more insecure. Rick worked as a construction manager, and he didn't earn as much as my father did, which was a sore point for him. And I really loved bragging about my father to rub it in his face. I didn't ever think that he'd be able to use that against me someday, to be honest. I spent a couple of years at home with them and tried my best to put up with Rick for my mom's sake. And then it was finally time for me to move out for college, which I was really looking forward to, because then I would only have to come back home for the holidays and I wouldn't have to see Rick around the house at all times. I was mostly relieved, but I was also a little afraid of what my mom would have to go through. But I couldn't just give up on college, and I knew that I had to go. I decided that I would come back home every other weekend to make sure that my mom was doing all right. But I didn't tell her about this plan because I wanted it to be a surprise. The day that I left for college, my mom was very emotional, and we had a tearful goodbye, while Rick couldn't stop smiling and even handed me some cash as a gift. It couldn't be more obvious that he was really happy to see the last of me. My father was the one paying for me to go to college, so I wasn't too worried and went away without a care. I did visit home periodically on alternate weekends to check up on my mother for the first couple of months as I'd planned. But after a while, my mom told me not to visit unless it was the holidays because my coming back around repeatedly really got on Rick's nerves. And then she told me something that was incredibly painful to hear back then, and it still hurts now. She told me that Rick would mostly be in a bad mood whenever I was around, and that meant that he would be awful to her as well. But when I was not around, he seemed to be a perfectly pleasant and reasonable guy. So now she wanted me to reduce my visits because she thought that I was the problem and made it sound like they would be better off without me. It felt bad, and I was really depressed for a while after that. But I made up my mind that I was not going to go back home until Christmas at the very least. I even spent my Thanksgiving break away from home in a hotel, since it was a shorter break. I told my dad about it, and he was really pissed, but I told him not to talk to my mom about it because if I was a problem for her, then I would just clear out, and I was fine with it. I did keep in touch with my mom, but our conversations were just not the same anymore, and after a while, it just stopped out of nowhere. So when I finally did go back home for Christmas, I wasn't too excited to see my mom. I thought that she would be pleased to see me back home, but when I showed up, she actually seemed alarmed. Before either of us could say anything, a guy I didn't recognize walked out of the door and thanked my mom for lunch and left. I was really confused, and then my mom explained to me that he was a tenant because Rick had given up the first floor for rent. We lived in a 2-story house, and the first floor had always been mine, so I knew that meant that Rick had given up my room for rent. She let me in and told me that she could explain everything, but I need to be patient. I was upset, and I started feeling even worse when I entered the living room and I saw Rick drinking on the couch. He made a face when he saw me, and I lost my cool and confronted him about the room. Very nonchalantly, he informed me that since I didn't live here anymore and I was an adult, he didn't think that it was necessary for him to keep the room empty for me and had put it to use by renting it out so he could make some extra cash. I called him an idiot and then asked him if he had even considered where I would stay when I came back home. He smiled at me, which pissed me off even more, and told me that since my dad was so wealthy, he was sure that he would make some arrangements for me and wouldn't let me live on the street, so there was no reason for me to get so worked up over nothing. I was so angry that I couldn't even say anything to him, so I turned to my mother instead and asked her if she was okay with this. And she said nothing. She just hung her head and said nothing. And that was pretty much the last straw for me. I was about to fight with Rick and demand my room back, but at the end of the day, I didn't think there was a point in doing that, and I didn't want to waste my breath. So I just took my stuff and walked out of the house. I expected my mother to come after me, but she didn't even do that. And I could hear the two of them arguing inside the house while I waited for a cab. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but my mom sounded angry, which was a relief because at least she was saying something. But after that incident, I pretty much made up my mind that I was never going to go back there. I tried for years to be there for my mom, and if she couldn't value that, then it was her loss. That day was the last time I ever saw my mother or Rick, for that matter, and once I got into the cab, I never looked back again because I was just done with my mother then. After that, I talked to my dad about what happened, and he told me that from then onwards, I could just visit him whenever I needed to go back home. And that's what I used to do every holiday. I would fly out to him, and once I graduated, I moved in with my dad. He got me my first internship and eventually my first job. I still live with him, and he's pretty much the only family I have now. I stopped speaking to my grandparents around the same time as my mother, and it was easy because we were never really that close. My dad's parents had both passed away when I was really little, so I never really got to know them, and now my dad is all I have for my family, and he can say the same for me too. We aren't sad about it, it's just what it is, and we've accepted it. To be honest, we're pretty content living with each other because he's my best friend, and I honestly couldn't have asked for a better father. Things have been going great until last week when my mother finally reached out to me after almost 7 years of not being in touch. She reached out to me on Facebook and told me that she needed to talk to me because it was an emergency and she really needed my help. She told me to come visit her as soon as possible because this wasn't something she could discuss online. So I responded to her and told her that I didn't even live in the same city as them anymore and it wasn't possible for me to visit her. So then she told me that it would be okay even if I just called her and gave me her number, but I told her that I wasn't interested in whatever she had to say and left it at that. She didn't stop trying and kept texting me for the next couple of days, but I still didn't reply. So she finally sent me a text telling me what had happened and why she needed my help. Apparently, she and Rick had taken a huge personal loan of about $80,000 from Rick's boss and had told him that they needed it to pay for my tuition. And now that so many years had passed, his boss was finally asking them to return the money. But it was a huge amount and they couldn't just give him that money, so now they needed me to pretend to be sick or something so that his boss would sympathize with them and wouldn't sue them since they had signed paperwork and everything for the loan and had promised to pay him back with interest. It was an insane plan and I didn't want to play any part in it. Even if I had been on good terms with my mother and Rick, I wouldn't have agreed to this, and that's exactly what I told her. She didn't reply to that for a couple of days, but then a few days ago she texted me again and told me that she was in my city and that she needed to see me. I was shocked that she was going to such extreme lengths, but I guess it figured because she was in a lot of trouble and she was counting on me to bail her out. I told her that I was not going to come and meet her because I really wanted no part of this. It all just sounded really shady and dangerous, and if she really wanted to be out of trouble, then she should just agree to pay back the amount in installments eventually and hope that Rick's boss is fine with that. But she texted me and actually said that even if I didn't want to help her out with the plan, she was okay with it. But she just wanted to see me one last time since she'd come all the way here and couldn't leave without at least meeting me once. I was aware that she was bluffing, but I still agreed to meet her for lunch because I wanted to see her, and I did miss her a lot. Yesterday we finally met and it was quite emotional for the first couple of minutes, but she ruined it by bringing up the loan and her plan within half an hour, and I was so exasperated that I didn't even entertain any of it and just left without a word. She kept calling my name, but I walked away quickly, got into my car, and drove back home as fast as I could. I regretted even giving it a shot, and it was kind of my fault for meeting her, even though I knew that she was bluffing, so that's on me. But I don't think I have anything else to feel bad about, and neither does my dad. My mother, however, does not share the same opinion as us. She sent me a long video yesterday, really late at night, and it was pretty obvious to see that she was drunk and crying. She said that she expected me to help her out because I had been her shield throughout my childhood, and she knew that she'd screwed up in the past, but she was really disappointed that I was getting revenge instead of being the bigger person, especially when there was so much at stake. She was extremely emotional, and it was hard to make out what she was saying because she was crying so hard, and also the alcohol was slurring her words. But I could tell that she was very upset with me. She kept saying that she'd always believed that she could always count on me, but I'd proved her wrong and she was extremely disappointed. By the end of the video, she had pretty much dissolved into tears and I felt disgusted with myself when I finished watching it. In spite of everything that happened, I do love my mother and I can't bear to see her this way. I also can't imagine her going to prison, which is exactly where she might end up if she doesn't repay that money or I don't buy her some more time. She kind of got lost after she married Rick, but before that she'd always been a loving and caring mother, and this is my one chance to repay her for everything that she did for me. But at the same time, I know that I shouldn't be putting myself at risk by involving myself in this situation. For starters, my mother hasn't even told me what exactly they took that personal loan for, and I don't think I can get involved without knowing all the facts. On top of that, this is not even a foolproof plan, and it can totally backfire on them if they don't really think it through. And their boss isn't exactly stupid. He might be able to see right through them and call their bluff, which might be very dangerous for them. I really do want to help my mother out, but I really don't think that I should do it at the cost of my own reputation. I don't know if that makes me a selfish person or not. I know it sounds like it does, and my common sense is telling me not to get involved, but I just don't know. I don't want my mother to go to prison. AITA for not wanting to help my mom dodge legal trouble for being unable to repay a loan. Update 1. I made the very difficult decision of blocking my mother so she isn't able to contact me anymore. It was hard, but I needed to do it, and now that it's done, I feel kind of relieved. I talked to my dad about the video and everything, and he told me that it was great that I didn't fall for it because she was clearly just trying to manipulate me emotionally. She knew that I valued her more than anything in the world and would jump at the chance of getting me to help her out. A lot of you guys in the comments said that I have major mommy issues, and I guess that's true, as much as I hate to admit it. Reddit can't solve that, but therapy can, so I'm looking into therapists for now because I don't think that it's healthy for me, and I hadn't ever considered it before, but it's about time. I also did some digging and found out about Rick's boss, and all I can say is that I'm so glad that I didn't agree to help my mother out, because that would have completely messed my conscience up. It wasn't too difficult to find out. All I had to do was stalk Rick's social media. He had a lot of photos with his co-workers, and the oldest guy there was very clearly his boss since he dressed differently and also just gave off that vibe. So I went to his account, and that's where I realized why exactly Rick and my mother thought that maybe pretending to be sick would make him back off for at least a while. His boss had a daughter whom he lost to cancer just a couple of years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, Rick and my mother were probably planning to make me pretend to be sick, and that would make their boss go easy on them because he would feel empathetic towards them. So not only was it a very stupid plan, it was also extremely insensitive and cruel of them to use something like that against a person who had helped them out. After I found out about that, blocking my mother was pretty much a piece of cake. I didn't know whose idea it was, but whoever came up with that was a disgusting human being, and whoever agreed to it was even more disgusting. And really, I'm just so glad that I didn't fall for any of my mother's strategies, because I'm just beginning to realize how manipulative and cunning she is as a human being. I never needed to protect her. I was the one who needed to be protected, and she failed miserably at that job. So it's safe to say I don't necessarily feel very guilty anymore, especially not after I realized what they were planning to do and why they were so insistent on using me to accomplish this disgusting goal of theirs. They deserve whatever punishment comes their way. Update 2. So since my mother couldn't contact me, she decided to get in touch with my dad instead. It was quite a surprise since they haven't spoken for about the same amount of time, or maybe even longer now that I really think about it. He told me that she told him pretty much the same things as she said to me and was trying to get him to sympathize with her and convince me to play the part that she had asked me to. But he told her very clearly that I wasn't interested, and I was a grown man, so she couldn't exactly force me to do something that I wasn't interested in. She also tried to yell at him and say that he was being unfair, and that she had a lot at stake here, so he needed to realize how desperate she was, as if this was somehow our fault. But my father was very firm and didn't budge. In fact, he even told her that if she bothered us again, then he would take matters into his own hands and would make sure that her husband's boss got to know exactly what she was trying to do behind his back to avoid repaying the money. But even that didn't seem to faze her, and she told him to go ahead and see if she cared, probably because she knew that we wouldn't stoop to that level. She did ask him to pass on a message to me, though, which he did. She told my dad that she wanted me to know that they hadn't borrowed that money to do something shady or frivolous, but they were actually about to start a business of their own, and she was trying to get back into work after a really long time. However, unfortunately, they got scammed out of their money and couldn't invest, which is why they were in such trouble now. They didn't want to get banks involved because they wouldn't be as lenient as Rick's boss had been, and they couldn't tell their boss the real reason why they needed the money because then that would be a conflict of interest. So they had to lie about it, and now they dug a grave that they couldn't get out without my help, and she was really desperate. But I made it very clear that I couldn't care less. They'd been nothing but cruel to me all their lives, and now I wasn't going to be stupid and get involved in something like this just to rescue them. I didn't like them or respect them, and I certainly didn't owe this to them like she'd been trying to get me to believe so far. I was out. She wasn't my family anymore, and so she needed to stop thinking that she could count on me. She couldn't, and she most certainly shouldn't be delusional. Update 3. Hi, so I finally heard back from my mother after almost 3 months of her being completely AWOL, and I learned that she is going to try and pay back the loan and she doesn't need my help anymore. She wasn't nice about it, obviously. She was pretty rude and actually said, "Thanks for nothing," in the message that she sent me. She used a different number since I'd blocked her previous one, but I guess this was important enough for her to actually get a new number for. It was just the usual. She told me that she was disappointed in me and she never wanted to see me again, which I was okay with because why would she even want to see me after whatever happened? She also said that she and Rick had sold the house now and were living in a smaller apartment, and she made it sound like it was my fault, which I don't even understand how that works. But I guess she can always just find a way to blame me for everything that goes wrong in her life. At this point, I shouldn't even be surprised. The bottom line is that I'm now finally done and that we don't have to talk to each other again. She hates me. I hate her. End of discussion. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.